Hi guys, I'm Jess, and in this video I'm going to be continuing my wedding planning series by talking about how to choose a wedding venue while planning during the COVID pandemic. Let's get started. So if you're like me and you're planning during the pandemic, you know how hard it is. Planning a wedding is always really stressful, so I hear, but especially during the pandemic because there's a lot of unknown factors that you don't normally have to deal with. Like, you have to have a lot of contingency plans because everything is changing day to day, week to week. It's really hard to plan. So I'm not saying that to stress you out. I'm just saying I feel for you and I can relate. But recently I posted a video talking about the first 6 steps to take when planning your wedding. You can find that here actually. And in the video, one of the things I talked about is how choosing your venue is one of the very first concrete steps you take in planning your wedding. And it occurred to me that choosing your venue actually plays a big part in some of your COVID stresses, you know, like whether or not you're gonna have to postpone or cancel or downsize or anything. I don't wish that on anyone. I hope that doesn't happen to any of you, but you know, being realistic, it just is a possibility, and it's a bummer, but it's a possibility. So for that reason, I decided to compile some of my tips for choosing your wedding venue to decrease that stress, to give you some contingency plans so that you don't have to worry about the what ifs that come with COVID. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So the first tip I have for you kind of applies to all brides, but I have specific tips for COVID brides when it comes to this, and that's choosing what type of venue you want. There's basically like 2.5 options for venue types, and that's an all-inclusive venue, a DIY venue, or kind of a mixture between the two. So an all-inclusive venue is one where they basically handle everything for you. That takes care of the catering, the linens, the DJ, the florist, all types of things. And that can differ from all-inclusive venue to venue. Sometimes they'll just take care of a few things, sometimes they'll take care of all of them. Of course, you'll learn about that if you go visit an all-inclusive venue. So it kind of takes the pressure off you for hand selecting each of those vendors. On the other hand, a DIY venue provides the rental space for you, but then you take care of everything else, or your planner does, in terms of choosing which vendors you want to help you with your big day. So there are pros and cons to each of these. All-inclusive, it definitely is less time consuming for you. However, you are limited in what options you have. You basically are stuck with whatever the venue gives you, for better or for worse, whereas a DIY venue, it is more time consuming for you to choose each of those vendors. However, you can make it more personalized and customized to what you want. The budget for all-inclusive versus DIY, it can differ a lot, you know, it depends on what you're choosing, but it is easier to go more on a budget if you're doing a DIY wedding, in my opinion. And then the mixture of the two is when venues have basically a DIY setup, except that they have a preferred vendor list. So what that means is for specific vendors, like say a caterer, they'll give you a list of 5 caterers that they'll work with, and then you can choose one of the 5. So it gives you a few options. It doesn't give you all the options in the world like a DIY, but you do have more of a choice with which vendor you choose. So that's the 0.5 of the 2.5 I was talking about. So where this really pertains to COVID brides, in my opinion, is when it comes to some of those contingency plans that I talked about. So for instance, if you were to postpone your wedding, it would look a lot different depending on what type of venue you chose. So if you chose an all-inclusive venue and you say, hey, we need to postpone, or they come to you and say they need to postpone, more than likely they'll handle the postponement on their end. That's something you should talk about before you book an all-inclusive venue, but more than likely they'll deal with it for you because it's typically all in-house for an all-inclusive venue. On the other hand, with a DIY venue, you would be calling all of the vendors yourself, asking to postpone, and what postponement looks like for each of those venues could differ widely. For instance, while your venue can keep your date and time just like a year from now or something like that, maybe your caterer is already booked for that day a year from now and they wouldn't be able to do that. Or maybe, hopefully not, they would charge you a fee for postponement or something like that. Depending on the venue, it might be a little bit safer to choose an all-inclusive venue in the event of a postponement rather than a DIY venue where a lot of the work and potential stress is on you for making sure that all of those vendors know that you're postponing and figuring out whether or not you can keep them as your vendor. Because it could end up that you have to replace some of the vendors if they're already booked for the new postponement date. I'm not all for all-inclusive venues or DIY. I'm just putting it out there that that's something to consider. So the next suggestion I have is to consider having your ceremony and reception outside, or just having a contingency plan to have it outside if the pandemic is still full throttle. So the CDC has said in the past that larger gatherings are safer when they're outdoors. I know in some states, at least in the US, the number of people you can have in a gathering is dependent on whether or not it's inside or outside. So having your event outside is a good option. That way you are more likely to have the number of guests that you want there. You are less likely to have to downsize, and it increases the safeness of your event if the pandemic is still going on at the time. So you could either plan from the get-go, it's gonna all be outside, or you could have a contingency plan with your venue, like, hey, if this doesn't work out, I can't have it in the barn or something, can I do it out in this field or something like that? So that's why it's definitely something to talk to your venue about. See if that's even possible. See if they have an outdoor event space that you could use. And another thing, and this goes with any outdoor event, make sure that there's some type of contingency plan to keep it inside if it does end up raining. And this might be a case where you'd want to actually have a tent rental on hand. I know that the deposits for those are pretty expensive, but that's something to just look into and see if it's worth it to you and your fiance to have that contingency plan at hand in case the pandemic is still going on and you want to have a larger gathering. This next tip kind of goes with the last one. That would be to talk to your venue about their ability to switch up the layout of your event. So what I mean by that is if you have a lot of guests, like say over 200 guests, and you're going to be having it in the barn at your venue space, what is the likelihood that if you have to downsize, God forbid, I hope that doesn't happen, but if you were to have to downsize and make your guest list smaller, is there a possibility that you can move from a bigger location at the venue to a smaller, more intimate setting? Of course, you do not have to do that if you don't want to. You could totally have a ballroom with 10 people in it. I think that's totally acceptable and that's totally okay if that's what you want to do. But if you did want to have a smaller setting, you can talk to the venue up front about whether or not that is a possibility if downsizing were to happen. So it's a good idea to talk to them about that up front so that you have that plan B, you have that flexibility that if your event's downsized, you can move to a smaller setting or a different type of space so you can match what you're going for with your wedding. The next suggestion I would have when you're going to meet with different venues is talk to them about what protocols they actually have in place for COVID right now. And I know ideally you probably are planning on it not being during COVID and everything's back to normal, but it's a good idea to at least know what they're currently doing so you have an idea of if something were to happen, they can help you out and can handle the situation. I'd say most venues probably have things in place already, like hand sanitizer, everyone wears masks, they can socially distance, but it's a good idea to know exactly what your venue is capable of doing to be flexible and adapt to the situation so that you know your guests will be safe, you'll be safe on your wedding day, and that they can kind of cope with whatever is going on with the pandemic at that time. In my personal opinion, if they don't have anything in place or they don't have contingency plans, that's not a super good sign that they're willing to adapt. I think that it's definitely a sign of flexibility and their willingness to help you make your day perfect if they have stuff in place to cope with the situation at hand. So figure out what their guidelines are, figure out if they have the ability to socially distance all of your guests, if they have the space for it too, just the physical space to do that, if they have some rules in place and things like that so that you can have your event within the means that they set forth. And the final thing I would suggest you talk to your venue about before booking them is to please see what their cancellation and postponement policy is. I'm sure this is like a no-brainer at this point, but I will say contracts are kind of hard to read and there's a lot of fine print going on. So make sure you read through any venue's contract before booking with them to see what their cancellation and postponement policy is. If they're really flexible and they give you your deposit back, or you can fully postpone to a similar date and they're willing to work with you, awesome. If there's no deposit returns under any circumstances, or they won't allow postponements or whatever, you know, maybe tread lightly, maybe think about it a little bit more with your fiance before booking them, but definitely just make sure you are good to go. It's just better to be safe than sorry. That's what it all comes down to. Better to have a plan B or some type of contingency plan in place so you know that you're gonna be good on your wedding day. That's really what this whole video is about, is just relieving some of that stress, making sure that you have all your ducks in a line so that you're good to go on your wedding day and there's no what ifs. I mean, there are still gonna be what ifs, but at least you know the answers to them. them. So I hope that this video is helpful for you. I hope you know that there's lots of brides out there that are in the same position and planning a wedding during this crazy pandemic and trying to figure everything out. So you're not alone. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. I'd love to answer them, have a little conversation going about this topic because I know what it's like, I promise. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it. And if you want to see more wedding related videos and DIY videos, please subscribe to my channel. I hope you have an awesome day. Good luck wedding planning, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.